Welcome back, everyone, to your favorite financial satire and straight-talking delivery of explosive facts about the economic disasters happening in broad daylight, courtesy of our ever-brilliant world governments. Today, as usual, we'll peel back the layers of yet another catastrophic decision that threatens to send ripples not only through regional economies but across the globe. Yes, I'm talking about Russia's Gazprom PJSC halting natural gas supplies through Ukraine as their 5-year transit agreement expired on January 1, 2025, at 8 a.m. Moscow time. So, what has Russia done this time? Gazprom has announced the complete cessation of natural gas transit through Ukraine. Sounds like just another headline, right? But, for those of you paying attention to global financial markets, geopolitics, or, let's face it, your own energy bills, this isn't just another headline. This is the beginning of a complex energy crisis that will have massive knock-on effects, culminating in greater inflation, increased European energy insecurity, and potentially hastening the next global recession. Before we dive deep into this mess, let's take a step back and look at the key players and contexts here. We're going to dissect how the energy games between Russia and Ukraine didn't just start yesterday. No, this is today's chapter in a decades-old saga tied to gas pipelines, political leverage, and deep historical grievances. But what about the broader context? What about Europe's energy security, inflationary pressure, and yet another misaligned government strategy? Let's rip into what's really going on here with the cold, hard facts. Let's be clear, this isn't the first time Russia has flexed its energy muscle, especially toward Ukraine and Europe at large. In fact, it's been a consistent tool in Russia's foreign policy toolbox for decades. Gazprom didn't just halt the supplies because Ukrainians refused to extend the agreement. No, it's part of a far bigger gambit tied to Russia's intentions of controlling Europe's energy markets while simultaneously punishing Ukraine for its stance on NATO and broader Western alliances. Historically, Europe has been heavily reliant on Russian natural gas. Approximately 40% of Europe's gas used to come from Russia, a fact that gave the Kremlin enormous control over what happens in the European energy market. Various pipelines, including the critical ones running through Ukraine, have been hotbeds of political back and forth, sanctions, counter-sanctions, and supply disruptions. Nord Stream 2, the controversial pipeline that seeks to bypass Ukraine, was itself a geopolitical debate of whether Europe should become even more dependent on Russian gas. The latest action halting transit through Ukraine is Russia's reminder to the world that energy supply and geopolitics walk hand in hand. The expiration of this transit agreement conveniently follows several escalations in Ukraine's war effort and tightening relations between Kiev and the West. But let's get real. This is also about controlling the flow of gas in ways that further undermine Ukraine's economy and twist Europe's energy security into an even tighter knot. On a fundamental level, energy costs have a direct influence on inflation. In Europe, where inflation has been persistently high, primarily due to skyrocketing energy prices from disrupted supply chains triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine, the cutoff of Ukrainian gas transit is a terrible omen for what's to come. In fact, we've seen European inflation flirt with double digits repeatedly in 2022 and 2023 due to unstable energy prices. It peaked at around 10.6% in October 2022, a direct consequence of the energy price shock caused by the war. For regular folks in Europe, this meant obscenely high electricity bills, fuel shortages, and an overall rise in the cost of living. Governments stepped in with short-term handouts, energy subsidies, and emergency measures. All these, of course, were funding black holes that widened budget deficits across Europe. But the problem here is structural. Europe is being choked by energy policies that inadvertently make it more vulnerable to Russian leverage. Take Germany, for example. Despite decades of warnings about relying too much on Russian gas, policymakers dragged their feet on diversifying energy sources. Efforts to ramp up renewable energy were repeatedly swept up in political indecisiveness and bureaucratic delays. And if anyone remembers the EU's rather optimistic Green Deal, stressing energy independence through renewables, well, that hasn't paid its dividends yet. Latest data shows that Europe actually reduced its net gas imports from Russia to about 15% of total supply by late 2024. And while that might seem like good progress on paper, it's still worrying how reliant Europe remains on outside powers for such a critical need. And let's not even get started on LNG imports. European countries are now scouring the globe for natural gas, forcing them to rely more on the US, Middle Eastern countries like Qatar, and even the volatile North African region. But diversification takes time, and Gazprom just cut the option of even maintaining steady flows through Ukraine. Think of this like pulling out the last safety fuse from a ticking bomb. Now, zooming in on the immediate ground zero impact, Ukraine. Already battered by over a year's worth of full-scale conflict with Russia, Ukraine's economy has suffered tremendously. The economic impact of war, including the destruction of physical infrastructure, depleted labor markets, increased government borrowing, and soaring inflation, is staggering. Gas transit provided transit fees, which were a vital component of Ukraine's income, at a time when every dollar counts. Over the years, transit fees have fluctuated between €1 billion and €3 billion annually depending on volumes. With this income source completely cut off, Kyiv is not just losing an important revenue stream but also crucial leverage it had over Moscow. Fewer transit obligations mean that Russia can now pivot more freely toward alternative routes, particularly as it pushes its Nord Stream 2 pipeline, once it navigates through sanctions and legal haggles. But the biggest concern is the energy supply in Ukraine itself. As Russia controls a significant portion of available gas pipelines and export routes, the risks of massive shortages are very real. While Ukraine managed to survive on alternative gas imports and its own reserves so far, the situation is becoming more precarious each day the conflict drags on. Higher gas prices, fewer import options, it's a cruel economic squeeze for a nation fighting for survival. It isn't just Europe and Ukraine at stake here. The global ramifications of skyrocketing natural gas prices will complicate economic recovery efforts from the current global slowdown. Let's not forget that energy prices directly affect fertilizer production, industrial output, heating costs, and transportation costs. In short, higher energy costs inflate prices across the board. Remember the episode when oil prices shot above $100 per barrel in 2022? Like a drop in a pond, the wave stretched out to hit every pocket of consumer spending. The current gas supply choke mirrors that situation all over again, only this time, it's compounded by the chronic weakness that's blasted through many Western economies like the US, UK, and others. Take the US, for example. Despite some positive growth metrics in 2024, inflation remains stubbornly high, fluctuating between 4.5 to 6% for much of the year. And this despite the efforts of both fiscal and monetary policymakers. Central banks like the Federal Reserve might be tempted to pause their rate hikes, but the coming crunch in global energy markets could force their hand yet again. What's next? Higher interest rates for longer, tighter consumer pockets, and a threat of diminished economic growth. In countries like Turkey and India, rising energy prices are even more ruinous. Emerging markets with high energy import dependency are already facing a double whammy of a strong dollar, high prices for imports, and now even less competitive energy options. Turkey's inflation crisis, having moderated from 80% in 2022 to an astonishing, but still high, 39% in 2024, could spiral into chaos once more. Speaking of government failures, how did Europe's politicians let themselves get played so easily? The truth is, government responses to the rising energy crisis have often been reactive, short-term, and even exacerbating long-term problems. France, for instance, prides itself on nuclear energy. It generates the majority of its electricity that way. But even France has had to import emergency energy supplies from its neighbors. Germany, despite its history of economic pragmatism, seems to have been blind to the dangers of dependence on one source. Its own energy transition policy, spearheaded by ambitious green objectives, may have pushed Germany toward renewables too fast without addressing reliability. As a result, energy shortages in the region have become alarmingly recurrent, and German industries have been forced to slash output as a result. A recent report from the International Energy Agency, IEA, noted that Europe needs to spend an additional €1 trillion by 2030 on energy infrastructure, efficiency, and alternative energy development just to make up for losses it incurred through inconsistent management over the past decade. This brings up questions about how quickly these measures can really be implemented when domestic industries face energy rationing now. Let's face it. The writing has been on the wall for some time now. The IMF, World Bank, and OECD are all forecasting sluggish global growth for 2025, projecting it will float somewhere between 2.5% and 3.1% due to stagnant investment flows, squeezed consumer spending, and cooling demand in key markets. But, with gas prices rising and critical links like Russia-Ukraine transits being severed, we might need to pencil in even more pessimistic estimates. For 2025 projections globally, oil prices have risen once more to around $95 per barrel, and natural gas prices in Europe have nudged back toward €80 to €100 per megawatt-hour, still well above the pre-war averages of €15. Unsurprisingly, this hits manufacturing output hard and decimates the already insipid global recovery. Frankly folks, this whole situation leaves us staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, with a finger tensing on the trigger. By halting its gas supplies through Ukraine, Gazprom's move has far-reaching consequences far beyond the borders of Eurasia. It sets the European economy on edge, deepens Ukraine's plight, fuels inflation, and ultimately leaves the world more vulnerable to an impending economic crisis. If you're wondering why politicians can't seem to fix this, whether in Brussels, Moscow, or beyond, it's not by accident. Strategic maneuvering, complacent energy policies, and delayed responses to climate change have gifted us this beautiful storm barrel racing toward us. Let's hope there's a safety net somewhere in this catastrophic freefall. But looking at the latest numbers and policies from 2024, optimism seems like a dangerous luxury at this point. So, yet again, it's ordinary folks who will carry the brunt. But, hey, at least someone in a government office somewhere will be able to boast about transitioning towards greener policies in their electoral speeches, as you, dear viewer, scramble to keep the lights on. Catch you next time, and buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride.